Well, hello again. I want to tell about an incident during the Second Seminole War that has some interesting artifacts associated with it. It's known as the McLane Massacre and happened in West Gadsden County, uh, in a town known as Greensboro, which is west of Quincy. And so if you're ever going down, I think it's Highway 90, is it on? But anyway, it's worth a visit. If you ever go there. This happened on April 10th, 1840. Okay, where's my, there we are. This is known as the Detzel House in Greensboro, built for the physician of the town, Dr. Detzel. 1912 was when it was built, a bungalow house. Kind of neat because it has the wooden floors and the old doorknobs or something kind of like in the house I grew up. So, it's a real pleasure seeing this house. Used to see them all the time. They're just kind of rare nowadays. And this is the museum for the West Gadsden Historical Society, I think it is. But uh, I'm going to have a video in the description of this event that is told by the descendants of the McLean family. Anyway, you walk in the house, take a right, and there's a room you'll enter. There's some interesting artifacts. Oh, that flag up top, it's the remains of a flag that got shredded during Hurricane Michael in 2018, devastated really the whole county and surrounding counties of this area. But if you look in the display case here in the middle of the screen, there's kind of a brown thing. That's a pine knot or a nodule in the pine tree where this sap kind of collects in the wood and it makes it hard as a rock and is, also good for building houses back then too, which is why you don't want to have house fires because it burns like paper too. So, but the pine knot is an incident or a participant in this incident, and it's actually actual artifact, as is the musket barrel you see behind it. That's the remains of the musket barrel. Underneath the display case, there's a picture on the right. That's John McLean. He's the one who owned that gun barrel, and more about him in a minute. And underneath in those other two frames, you can't tell it right here, but there's, I think the bottom one is a land grant, and the frame above that is a picture. And oh, on the other end of the case, Alexander McLean, son of John McLean, holding the bow and arrow dropped by the Indians when John McLean was shot by a bow and arrow or shot at. This John McLean right here, in his old age, he passed away, I think, about 1907, and they recorded his story about 1902. It was in the very first issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly, his account. So it's kind of interesting that you have an account of the eyewitness to the event of the Seminole War over 60 years after it happened. And this is a drawing he did that was on the wall. It's hard to see because the lighting just wasn't very great. It's behind glass that's protecting the image. It's a pencil sketch that John McLean did. Let's see if we can get a little closer. It's the Indians attacking. You can see the house there. They're attacking, and it was only like 12 or 15 was the dimensions. And there's another building, an outbuilding there, maybe the kitchen. There's a barn and blacksmith shop. You see the Indians around here. I think John McLean, I think he's right there shooting his rifle. You see some bow and arrows and some muskets. So what happened is that in 1836, after the Seminoles started rising up, the Creeks started rising up too, mainly because of the land theft and uh, the fraud and deceit that they had gone through to lose all their land, and they just kind of fed up and rose up, led by a warrior named Jim Henry, whose warriors went and burned down the town of Roanoke in southwestern Georgia. And a lot of that was fought by the Georgia militia, the Alabama militia, the Creek Reservation. What was left of it was 5 counties in Alabama, and they were pushed south into Georgia. This was known as the Second Creek War, and it was very bloody. You had battles involving a large number of militia soldiers and a large number of Creek Indians who had a lot of women and children who got caught up in those battles. High number of killed and casualties in those battles. The remaining refugees kind of ran down into Florida to join up with the Seminoles. And so this is a war party here. They said that these Creek Indians were part of Pescofa's band. I don't know if that's true or not, if they're just blaming him for everything else that went on. So here is the account from the newspaper of the day. It's real short. There's many versions of the story. This is a short version from the Floridian newspaper, May 2nd, 1840. The report of a murder of another family by the Indians mentioned last week is confirmed. The Indians, about 15 in number, appeared on the premises of Mr. McLean's on Tologia Creek. Tologia is the Creek word for turkey, early in the morning, and were discovered by one of the daughters who ran to the house and gave information to the family. Miss McLean took her children, 3 in number, and made for the hammock. So Miss McLean and the 3 daughters were running towards the wood lines as their son was firing at the Indians, and he was trying to cover them, but the Indians saw them and cut them off and killed them. It said Miss McLean took her children, 3 in number, and made for the hammock when they were overtaken and inhumanely butchered by the Indians. Mrs. McLean's throat was cut, and her children were beaten to death with pine knots. And in that display case, that's one of the pine knots right there. That's the actual artifact for the events. The Indians returned to the house where Mr. McLean's son, about 16 years of age, actually was like 19 or 20 at the time, had determined to defend himself and fired frequently at the Indians, and then attempting to fire the house by means of arrows wrapped with blazing cotton. Failing in these efforts when approached with a torch, but he was shot down by the lad and since found dead. And that musket barrel you see back in the back of the case, that is the musket barrel that he shot him full buckshot in the gut and mortally wounded the warrior. They set fire to several outhouses. That's the kitchen and blacksmith shop barn, and went off. Mr. McLean was absent at the time, but returned towards evening to witness the inhumane sacrifice of his family. Information was given to the troops in the quarter as soon as possible, who went in pursuit, and after following the trail for a day or two, returned without finding the Indians. The greatest vigilance is necessary to prevent these frequent depredations. And although several company of troops continuing scouting in that quarter, the Indians seem to be able to elude all pursuit. We know not how or when these depredations are to be ended. Actually, they'd be ended in about 2 or 3 years later. It would go on to then. So several different versions of the story. One side of the story that's not often told is the military report, and this is the letter written from Fort Braden, April 26, 1840. Major Fauneroy, Thomas Fauneroy, he's with the 2nd Dragoons. Report of a massacre of a woman and children. They're writing to General Taylor in 22nd March 1840. What? Wait a minute. 22nd of March was before that. I don't know. They don't even know what time it is or what month of the year. Received May 8th, 1840. So let's see what Major Roy has to say. Written from Fort Virginia Braden, Middle Florida. Fort Braden is still around in name, a community in western Leon County. Fort Brayton is like halfway between Fort Swearigan, which I mentioned the other week, north of Wakulla Springs, to the Apalachicola River where Fort Preston is. So Fort Brayton was kind of halfway in between. And it says, I have the honor to report that on the 25th instance, a Miss McLean and two children were killed by Indians on the Tologia, about 7 miles from the station occupied by the detachment of Captain Bullock's company. That's Fort Preston, and about 26 miles from this post, which is Fort Brayton. Every exertion was made by all the troops, both on this side and the west side of the Ochlockonee River. All the men possibly that could leave the posts were on pursuit, but the extent of the hammocks and swamps enabled the enemy to steal through to the house, a most isolated spot, and commit the murders alluded to. They were pursued by a large party from this post who followed them back to the Ochlockonee and arrived here at 8 last night. The whole company left at 12 at night to give pursuit on their retreat to the east. Captain Hutter, I think Captain Hutter's with the 6th Infantry. Anyway, or he might be with the Dragoons, said, receive full information of the course of the Indians and is directed to pursue with his and Lieutenant Prince's company with all possible intelligence. And this last paragraph at the bottom of the letter, it's important. I think it's a key reason why this happened. Context is everything. It says, I feel it necessary to say that Captain Bullock's reports to me that a party from his command visited this house and its vicinity every day previous to the occasion related above, and that his whole command is now out scouting or scouring the country on both sides of the Tologia River to its junction with the Ochlockonee. So I think that's very important is when you get down into the details, that the Creek Warriors did not attack just, at random, that they had seen that the soldiers would go here every day, stop for lunch, and Miss McLean would make them sandwiches, according to the story, at least the officers. So the warriors knew that this was an important stop for the army scouting around in the area. So they exacted their revenge on Miss McLean and her family. The post returns. Is this Fort Virginia Brain for the month of April 1840. Second Dragoons has 36 soldiers at the post. At the bottom, it has one soldier who deserted. That's about half a company size. It's commanded by Second Lieutenant Charles May, I believe. Lieutenant Lowry also, and absent is Marshal S. Howe, captain of Second Dragoons. He is under arrest at St. Augustine for killing one of his soldiers that I mentioned in a previous video. This is the post returns of Fort Preston, what's now Bristol, April 1840. Second Dragoons, Company E. Let's see, the other one was Company C. Okay. Company E, Second Dragoons, 38 soldiers at this post. Commanded by Captain Bullock. And there's also Lieutenant Hill, Surgeon Madison Mills. Absent is Owen Ransom. And this is the grave site of the son that survived, John K. McClure. He survived. It said that he even took that musket with him in the Civil War. He saw a lot of action. A lot of the Florida soldiers that were mustered into the Confederate Army spent a lot of time outside of Florida. I think he might have been in Gettysburg. He was at Antietam, maybe at Appomattox even, saw a lot of action. Might have even been wounded John K. McClure, 10th Florida Infantry, CSA. This is at Pine Grove Cemetery, southwest of Greensboro. And a couple miles away, there's Sycamore, uh, Sycamore Cemetery. Ah, can't read it because my toolbar is in the way on my screen. This is the memorial to Mrs. McLean and her children who were killed. McLean, McLean in memorial on April 10th, 1840. Miss Nancy Jane McLean, age 40, was shot. Catherine McLean, age 13, was shot and scalped by the Indians. Two small children were killed with pine knots. Their heads bashed in with pine knots. And this said the town, I think the former town of Sycamore community, about all that's left is a cemetery and a small wooden church here. Was looking around the graveyard. Interesting, found this, said this looks like a World War I soldier. Pretty decorated tombstone, has one of those gold star flags on top. Says Corporal James Mark Fletcher, 1892 to 1920, 642nd Aero Squadron. Well, I couldn't find any information on the graveyard, so I hunted around. I finally found information in the Miami Herald newspaper. An obituary said James Fletcher, James Marcus Fletcher is what they say, met his death last evening while blowing up stumps on land he was clearing. Say was using dynamite to clear stumps, and as you guessed, that ended badly. Said one failed to ignite. So when he was done clearing some other stumps, he came back and tried to remove the dynamite cap from the dynamite, and it exploded and killed him instantly. So he's brought home, and the home, his former home, he is 28 years old. This obituary said that he was unmarried. Another one said that he was married, not sure which is which. So he survived the war as a Aero Squadron to die 2 years after the war, or a year and a half more. So that's kind of interesting. It's always interesting what you find in cemeteries. And there's the newspaper article there from the Miami Herald. You always find something interesting going around some of these old cemeteries. So I thought that might be an interesting story from the Second Seminole War. Not many people know of it. If you're ever on, I think it's Highway 90, west of Quincy, going through the town of Greensboro, look up the Detzel House and see these interesting artifacts that survived from the war. And look up the first issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly that has John McLean's account of the incident. So that is pretty cool that somebody recorded the incident while he was still alive. So I hope you enjoyed that short video. Being near the anniversary, I thought was kind of appropriate for that, talk